Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Waterfront Manhattan, From Henry Hudson to the High Line, by Kurt C. Schlichting, narrated by Joel Richards. Preface. My engagement with Manhattan dates back to childhood trips from Connecticut to the city with my grandmother or extended family on the old New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. Later, in high school and college, the lure of New York's energy beckoned. When starting graduate school at New York University in 1970, I moved to the Lower East Side to share a loft on East 10th Street. The methadone clinic across the street drew junkies who filled the stoops during the day. Street people lived in Tompkins Square, and the squats on the adjacent avenues provided a real-time view of the urban crisis. June 2017. The city's vibrant Hudson River Park could not have looked more beautiful, filled with thousands of people enjoying the breathtaking views of the Hudson and, across the water, to the brand-new waterfront in Jersey City and Hoboken. Frisbees and balloons filled the air. Upscale parents pushed strollers along the shoreline. Tourists from all over the world joined New Yorkers to enjoy Manhattan's reclaimed meeting of land and water. At Stuyvesant Cove Park, the path winds along the East River from East 20th Street south to the Williamsburg Bridge and then down to the Battery. Across the East River, gleaming new apartment buildings line the shore in Long Island City and Williamsburg, two city neighborhoods in the midst of a renaissance. Farther to the south, Brooklyn Bridge Park offers spectacular views of Lower Manhattan, crowded with gleaming new office buildings and home to Wall Street, the center of world finance. In Greenwich Village, luxury buildings on Charles Street cast deep shadows on Charles Lane, the once infamous Pig Alley, where drunks from the longshoremen's bars on West Street slept off a bender. Directly across the street in Hudson River Park, where ships from all over the world once tied up, two new rebuilt piers offer space for sunbathers to lounge and catch the gentle breezes. North at the Chelsea piers, people golf and rent sailboats. June 1971. As usual, some friends and I ended up late at night at the White Horse Tavern on Hudson Street in Greenwich Village, looking for the ghost of Dylan Thomas. I faced the dangerous prospect of walking across town to my apartment on East 10th Street. On the corner of my block, even the prostitutes who worked the Fleabag Hotel on 2nd Avenue would be afraid to be out. Just 2 weeks earlier, at about 8:30 p.m., I was in my third-floor loft and heard loud banging in the hall. My neighbor and I looked down the stairwell and saw 3 guys with a 4x4 trying to bang down the door of an apartment on the next floor. We ran into my apartment, bolted the door, and called the police. They arrived in a few minutes and arrested the would-be thieves. We watched as the miscreants were loaded into a squad car, which drove away with the 4x4 sticking out of the trunk. Back at the White Horse, John and the other Jersey boys offered me a ride across town before they hit the Holland Tunnel and home. A problem immediately arose. Earlier in the evening, John had parked on West Street, under the elevated highway, and now we faced the prospect of walking 3 blocks down Perry Street to West Street at 2 a.m. in the morning. We were all terrified. 5 20-something rugby players, fearful to walk through an apocalyptic streetscape in Greenwich Village to the crumbling understructure of the West Side Highway, the abandoned warehouses, and the dilapidated piers along the Hudson River. We survived the journey, and I have lived to marvel at the rebirth of the Manhattan waterfront and the city of New York. This book views the history of the Manhattan waterfront as a struggle between public and private control of what is New York City's most priceless asset. From colonial times until after the Civil War, the city ceded control of the waterfront to private interests, for the latter to build a maritime infrastructure. With only finite space available, despite the man-made land along the shore, a battle ensued among shipping interests, the railroads, and the ferries for access to the waterfront. The public was excluded from the water side. In the second half of the 19th century, The city of New York regained control of the waterfront, and Manhattan and the Port of New York remained preeminent until after World War II. A whirlwind of forces beyond the control of either public or private interests followed. Crime on the waterfront, the revolution brought about by containerized shipping, the de-industrialization of New York City and its metropolitan region, the changing ethnic and racial makeup of the waterfront neighborhoods, and the ecological vulnerability of the extension of the Manhattan shoreline out into the Hudson and East Rivers. Hurricane Sandy provided a devastating warning of the consequences of global warming. New York recovered from the depths of darkness in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. The Manhattan shoreline has been reimagined as a place for the public to enjoy and the affluent to live. A complicated web of public and private initiatives has transformed the waterfront from the center of the city's maritime world to a magnificent setting for leisure and recreation. 1. Growth, Decline, and Rebirth. Manhattan Island, just 22.4 square miles in total, 23 miles long, and, at 14th Street, 2.3 miles wide, would emerge as the most populous place in the United States and the country's preeminent city. Until consolidation took place in 1898, the island alone constituted the city of New York. Brooklyn, across the East River on Long Island, was a separate city, and the outer boroughs remained largely rural farmland. At the time of the first U.S. Census in 1790, the Atlantic seaboard cities, Boston, Newport, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, vied to capture the new country's maritime commerce. By 1850, New York City's population had soared to over 500,000, and it reigned as the leading metropolis in the country. The growth and prosperity of the port explains the dominance of the city in the 19th century. Manhattan became a global city by building maritime links across the oceans, along the Atlantic coast, and inland to the Midwest and New England. The shorefront of Manhattan Island, the boundary between water and land, served for hundreds of years as the center for the trade, shipping, and commerce of the nation as the port became the busiest in the world. No other activity took precedence over commerce. The shore remained a place apart, a world of piers and docks, longshoremen, and ships, tugboats, and ferries filled with cargo and freight, as well as a site where millions of immigrants entered the promised land. Nature provided New York with a sheltered harbor, but to flourish, the port required a complex maritime infrastructure of wharves, piers, warehouses, and waterfront streets to facilitate the transfer of goods and people between water and land. A busy port depended on a large workforce of itinerant day laborers who lived nearby and would be available on the docks in all weather as ships arrived and departed. A prosperous seaport needed substantial investment in its waterfront infrastructure to provide ships and merchants with access at reasonable costs. New York faced a challenge here: to find the necessary capital to build and expand its maritime infrastructure. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the city's government did not have the responsibility or the fiscal resources to develop needed port facilities. To build this infrastructure, the city gave away a precious asset: the land under the water around the lower part of Manhattan Island. The municipal government awarded these water lots to private individuals to build wharves and piers, surrendering public control of the waterfront. For over 250 years, private enterprise ran the waterfront. The city played merely a peripheral role. By the end of the Civil War, chaos threatened the port's dominance. In 1870, the city and the state created the Department of Docks to exercise public control and rebuild the port's maritime infrastructure for the new era of steamships and ocean liners. 100 years later, technological change, in the form of container shipping and jet airplanes, rendered Manhattan's waterfront obsolete within an incredibly short time span. The maritime use of the shoreline collapsed, mirroring the near death of the city of New York in the 1970s. Ships disappeared, and abandoned piers and empty warehouses lined the waterfront. The city slowly and painfully recovered. The vacated waterfront allowed visionaries and planners to completely reimagine a shore lined with parkland. Along the revitalized waterfront, luxury housing has transformed the neighborhoods where Irish longshoremen once lived. A few remaining piers offer spectacular views of the city's waterways. The rebirth has been driven by complex private/public partnerships, with the city of New York playing only a peripheral role. The contentious question of private versus public control of the waterfront remains a continuing issue in the 21st century. New York Harbor. To the south of Manhattan lies New York Harbor, one of the greatest natural harbors in the world, providing deep but sheltered anchorage from all but the most violent ocean storms. Both Staten Island and the Brooklyn section of Long Island form a natural barrier between the harbor and the Atlantic Ocean. The waters of the Upper Bay offer space for hundreds of ships to anchor. Between Staten Island and Brooklyn, the Narrows forms a deep water entrance. From the Upper Bay, the Hudson River leads north to Albany and to waterways across the state that reach the Great Lakes and the Midwest. The East River, a tidal estuary, connects to Long Island Sound and provides a protected passage to New England. Land sloping gently down to sea, deep water extending almost to the shoreline, and a minimal rise and fall of the tide offered an ideal location for maritime trade. Both the Hudson and East Rivers are tidal estuaries, and twice a day the tide floods, up the harbor and the rivers, and ebbs, down the harbor to the ocean. Sailing ships took advantage of the tidal currents to assist them in entering or departing from the harbor. When the first Dutch ships arrived in New Amsterdam in 1624, they anchored in the East River. People and cargo were rowed ashore in small dories. The reverse took place as a ship readied for departure. Once the volume of shipping increased, the use of dories proved to be time-consuming and expensive. A more efficient system involved building wooden or stone structures, wharves, paralleling the shorefront, or piers, extending from the shoreline out into the water. Both simplified the unloading and loading of ships moored to the wharves or piers. On the shore adjacent to these structures, waterfront streets facilitated the transportation of goods and people inland. Building Manhattan's waterfront infrastructure. The English captured New Amsterdam from the Dutch in 1664 and renamed the city New York. Two charters established the city of New York as a corporation, with its own government consisting of a common council and a mayor, distinct from the colony of New York. The 1686 Dongan Charter, and later, the Montgomery Charter of 1730, legally defined the waters around Manhattan Island to be the property of the city. The Montgomery Charter specified that the city owned all of the underwater land extending out from the island for 400 feet beyond the low water line. It created a resource of immense value, water lots adjacent to the shorefront, and gave the corporation of the City of New York the legal right to grant the water lots to private citizens. The city used the water lots to attract private waterfront investment. First, the English governors, and later the city's common council, granted water lots to individuals, often the politically connected well-to-do who own the shoreline property. In return for a water lot grant, the private owners had a legal obligation to build a bulkhead out from the existing shoreline into the river, which would serve as a wharf, as well as to construct a new city waterfront street for public use. They could also build a pier out into the surrounding rivers. Such requirements under the grants, however, did not include specific construction details. Fees paid to use the wharves and piers went to these private owners, not the city. In addition, the grantees filled in their water lots, creating man-made land along the shore that they could then develop. On this new made land, the owners constructed warehouses, counting houses, tenements, and factories. The use of water lot grants and private investments ceded control of the waterfront from the city to private interests. The city could revoke the grants, but seldom did, and it exercised only weak regulatory power over the city's most valuable asset, direct access to the greatest natural harbor in the world. Thus, the shoreline of the city moved out into the Hudson and East Rivers. This waterfront real estate, created on made land, belonged to the grantees, not to the city of New York, and today it is among some of the most valuable real estate in the world. For 300 years, the granting of water lots enlarged the island of Manhattan by 3.57 square miles, adding 2,286 acres. As the port grew, the city continued to use water lot grants to facilitate the building of additional infrastructure along the East and Hudson rivers. But the wharves alone could never meet the demand as the volume of shipping increased. By the Civil War period, captains, shipowners, and city merchants complained vociferously about the lack of pier space, the rotting wharves, poor maintenance, overcrowded waterfront streets, inadequate storage, corruption, and the gangs of thieves who pillaged the waterfront. Thunderous newspaper editorials warned that without dramatic improvements, New York City would lose maritime business to Boston, Baltimore, or Philadelphia. Private ownership had failed to build, maintain, and upgrade the essential infrastructure and threatened the port's maritime supremacy. In 1870, the city and the state of New York passed legislation to establish a public agency, the Department of Docks, to reassert public control over the waterfront. At great expense, the city purchased the wharves and piers from the private owners and set out to rebuild the waterfront, operating the port for the public good, not for private gain. The Department of Docks managed to accommodate vast changes in the harbor as the size of both cargo and passenger ships increased dramatically. The tables turned again at the beginning of the 20th century, when shipping companies, business leaders, and even the corrupt Longshoremen's Union warned of the coming demise of the harbor because of its mismanagement by the department. A whirlwind of change did arrive, but maladministration by New York City's Department of Docks played only a tangential role. Waterway empires. Taking advantage of nature's gifts, the Port of New York came to dominate three commercial waterway territories. The first, routes across the North Atlantic Ocean to and from Europe. The second, a coastal shipping empire to the American South and the Caribbean. And the third, inland transportation up the Hudson River to upstate New York, the Great Lakes, and Chicago, as well as up the East River, through Long Island Sound to Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New England. The city's most important international links stretched across the North Atlantic from New York to Liverpool in England and Le Havre in France. In the early 19th century, with relentless determination, the city's shipowners captured the North Atlantic waterway. New York Harbor served as the center of the country's export and import trade. All of New York's maritime rivals fell far behind. On October 27, 1817, a woodcut ad appeared in a New York newspaper announcing that as of the first week in January 1818, a new packet line of ships would begin monthly sailings from New York and, simultaneously, from Liverpool. The Black Ball Line, founded by 5 of New York's leading Quaker shipowners and merchants, guaranteed service from an East River pier regardless of the weather, including if there was a full cargo or not. Not only did the owners of the Black Ball Line, at great financial risk, begin a transportation revolution, but the packets also created a new communications link across the North Atlantic. In addition to cargo and first-class passengers, the packet ships carried commercial mail. An international trading system required the fastest communication possible between New York and Europe. Letters of credit, private banking correspondence, bills of sale, and specie had to be sent back and forth, and the packet lines provided fast, scheduled service. Rival packet lines to Liverpool followed, the Red Star Line and the Blue Swallowtail Line in 1822, and later the Dramatic Line and the New Line. Packet ships left New York and Liverpool every week of the month, every month of the year. No other port in the United States offered anywhere near this level of service. The Port of New York had packet lines not only to Liverpool, but also 2 lines to London and 3 to Le Havre, strengthening the city's hold on the ocean pathway to Europe. New York's link to Liverpool allowed the city to control the cotton textile trade between the slave plantations in the American South and the textile mills in Lincolnshire in northwestern England, to which Liverpool provided access. The Industrial Revolution in England created an insatiable demand for the high-quality cotton grown in the South. For more than a century, cotton remained the most valuable product produced by the American economy, creating a direct link between slaves on the southern plantations and the nascent industrial workforce laboring in the satanic conditions of the textile mills in England. New York Harbor and its shipping industry played a pivotal role. Each year, tens of thousands of cotton bales carried north on coastal ships arrived on the piers along the East and Hudson rivers. Once unloaded, the bales were carted along the waterfront to waiting packet ships bound for Liverpool. Textiles returned from Liverpool to be distributed throughout the country, including down the Atlantic coast to the south. Even cotton transported directly from the southern cotton ports to Liverpool arrived on ships owned or financed by New York shipping businesses. The city's merchant bankers developed a sophisticated system of international credit that enabled plantation owners in the South to purchase slaves and grow cotton, and then consign the cotton to traders who shipped it to England. In Liverpool, import merchants bought the cotton and then quickly sold it to the textile mills. Lastly, the swift packet ships returned from England carrying English gold and silver back to New York for the bankers to use both to settle accounts, including the funds advanced each year to the plantation owners in the South, and, of course, to take their own substantial profits. Capital accumulated in the cotton trade enabled the New York bankers to finance the shipping industry, the city's maritime infrastructure, and the burgeoning Industrial Revolution in the city and the United States. The second crucial waterway linked New York with coastal ports in the South, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and New Orleans, that handled the 18th century's key agricultural product, cotton. By 1832, New York ship owners established packet lines to all of the major southern ports. With scheduled service, these southern packets offered fast shipment of cotton to Liverpool, with the first leg running up the coast to the Manhattan waterfront, and the second leg traveling across the North Atlantic to England. New Yorkers owned many of the cotton ships that sailed directly from the southern ports to Liverpool. The city's merchants and bankers also provided crucial ancillary services, insurance, credit, export and import services with their Liverpool counterparts, and the settlement of international payments. The pivotal role played by New York, always at a substantial profit, infuriated the plantation owners and the Southern cotton aristocracy. The maritime historian Robert Albion referred to the city's dominance as enslaving the cotton ports. A third waterway empire ran to the north, up the Hudson River to Albany, and then west by the Mohawk River to central New York. From northern Alabama to Maine's border with Canada, the Appalachian Mountains separate the Atlantic seaport from the Midwest and, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, posed a serious challenge to travel. In upstate New York, a gap exists in the Appalachian Mountains along the Mohawk River and then across rolling countryside to Lake Erie at Buffalo. What became known as the water level route served as the ideal location for the Erie Canal and, later, the route of the New York Central Railroad across New York State and further west. The Erie Canal had an enormous impact on the history of the Port of New York, linking Manhattan to Chicago, the great city of the Midwest, characterized by historian William Cronin as nature's metropolis. New York captured the bounty of the Midwest. In return, imports from Europe bound for Chicago and the Central States came through the Manhattan waterfront, transferred from ocean-going packet ships to Erie Canal barges. Another key part of the inland waterway empire, the East River, connects New York's harbor to Long Island Sound. For over 90 miles, the Sound provides a protected water route to Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. From the race, which marks the eastern end of Long Island Sound, the ocean passage to Narragansett Bay is less than 30 miles. On the north side of the Sound, the Connecticut River is navigable to a point north of Hartford, and then from the Massachusetts border to the middle of Vermont. Steamboats connected the Port of New York with cities along the Connecticut coast, Narragansett Bay, and Massachusetts, extending the commercial reach of New York City. Local needs compounded the crush along New York City's shoreline. The rivers, bays, and Long Island Sound connected the growing city with a hinterland that supplied basic needs: food, wood for cooking and heating, and building materials. All goods had to be transported by water to the Manhattan waterfront. In addition, a fleet of ferries carried thousands of passengers across the waters each day to Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and New Jersey. These ferries, along with small sailing vessels, steamboats, and canal barges, competed for the limited space on the piers surrounding Lower Manhattan, adding to the congestion of people and goods on the waterfront. Manhattan's waterfront neighborhoods. For the Port of New York to grow and prosper, it needed more than nature's gifts, the port's infrastructure, and aggressive shipowners, merchants, and bankers. The thousands of ships in the harbor each year and the millions of tons of cargo that had to be moved across the waterfront required a large labor force. These men worked as day laborers, not as long-term employees, and they could never be sure of steady work. From the time of the Dutch, as each ship arrived or departed, from the largest ocean-going sailing ships to the small single-masted sloops or humble canal barges, the cry, "Alongshoremen," rang out, and hundreds hurried to the wharves and piers to secure a day's work on the docks. Loading, unloading, and moving cargo remained a labor-intensive process for centuries. The longshoremen worked long hours in all types of weather. A brutal system of day labor became enshrined by the shape-up, where hundreds of men stood at the pier entrance, hoping to be hired for the day. Pier bosses demanded kickbacks, loan sharks worked the docks, and prostitution and crime flourished nearby. A code of silence prevailed. Any longshoreman brave enough to speak out was often found dead, floating next to the pier with his throat slit. In the early 20th century, corruption prevailed in the Longshoremen's Union, which failed to protect its members. Organized crime eventually controlled the docks and shook down the shipping companies, which paid bribes in exchange for labor peace. Cargo theft reached epidemic levels. Waterfront corruption extended to the highest level of politics in New York City and the state. Longshoremen and other dock workers lived a few blocks away, in the immigrant neighborhoods along the East and Hudson rivers. Generations of immigrants, many from Ireland, worked the docks and endured lives of hardship and toil. A tribal way of life arose, where sons followed fathers down to the docks each day. On the nearby streets, the Irish waterfront laborers, their wives, and their children lived in crowded tenements. While their life was hard, many found refuge and spiritual support in the Catholic churches that served the waterfront. After World War II, crusading journalist Malcolm Johnson and a Jesuit priest, Father John Pete Corridon, led the fight for reform on the waterfront. They battled the corrupt Longshoremen's Union, the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, to rid the piers of mobsters who controlled the daily work on the docks. Johnson wrote articles in the New York Sun detailing the crime and corruption there, a series for which he won the Pulitzer Prize in 1949. His main source was Father Corridon, a priest who dedicated his ministry to helping the Irish on the Manhattan waterfront. Corridon eventually ran afoul of the Archdiocese of New York, which received generous support from Catholic executives in the shipping companies and the senior leadership of the ILA. Corridon provided Johnson and Bug Schulberg, a Hollywood screenwriter, with the material the latter used to write the script for the 1954 Academy Award-winning movie On the Waterfront, which starred Marlon Brando and was directed by Elia Kazan. This movie portrayed the dark world of the waterfront and generated enormous publicity, leading to calls for
Sample complete. Ready to continue?